Okay, everyone, welcome back. We are moving into week 2, and we're talking about research ethics today. This will be lecture 1A. These slides were starting to get a little long, and I know when we go into the history of things, things can get monotonous and quite boring. So I am going to break this up into 2 smaller lectures. And I will get these uploaded for you. And what we are going to do today is just talk a little bit about some of the horrific history that is associated with human research. We've been doing research for quite some times on human beings, and we have a very dark past associated with this. And this is an interesting topic because it shows how horrible human beings can be to one another. And when you look at that statement through the lens of medical research or medical experiments, it really could show just how horrible we can be to not only other human beings, but also other creatures in the animal kingdom. So there were a lot of things that had happened in the past that really kind of restructured and recapitulated how we conduct research in this day and age. Thank goodness. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit about this history, and I'm going to kind of drop you guys in right around the World War II era, because as you know, Nazi Germany, they were conducting some pretty sinister research on human beings to gain information that would give them advantage in the war and basically help them cover more ground. And we had done some pretty horrible things to our own people here in the United States with our own military people. We had done some very, very horrific things to Native Americans on the reservations, all in the name of research. So let's talk a little bit about this. None of this information is really going to be relevant for exams or anything like that, but it's important to know where we were, where we are, and where we're heading with conducting human research. Because in the realm of biomedical research or nutrition or exercise physiology, we generally tend to do research on human subjects. We want to understand what those applied sciences, which we talked about in our last lecture, right? How it impacts the physiology of a human being. So let's talk a little bit about what our topics are going to be today. So we are going to talk about the history of research ethics, just kind of briefly, and then the conflict of interest, the research misconduct, the informed consent, and the institutional review boards, the IRB, that will all be a part of the second ethical research. It just gets a little long. And when we're talking about this type of information, I don't want you guys falling asleep and drooling on your very expensive computers while you listen to me rant about various things. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the history of research, and let's drop in right here prior to World War II. So in this era, we really had no international guidance on human subject research. People could do what they want. They could do it how they wanted. There was no consequences for injuring a human being. Biomedical research had grown quite a bit during World War II. Like I said, Nazi Germany, not only them, but also America was leading the charge to compete with Nazi Germany. And at this time, we were really trying to understand the importance of infectious diseases. Not only understand what would happen if a biological agent was released on our own soldiers, such as anthrax and things like that, or other sort of chemical agents, but also what could we create that could potentially wipe out soldiers on the opposing side. So we really didn't have any information on consent or any knowledge that we would give human subjects about what we were doing to them. There was really no consent. So during this time, human research often lacked ethical standards and oversight. And this led to many studies being conducted without informed consent of participants. So we all know now that if we want to have research, if we want to do research within our labs, or we want to be researchers ourselves, we have to consent our participants, which means we have to be completely transparent about everything that we are conducting from A to Z, So they could say, yeah, I'm not really about this and I'm out. Before World War II, that was not really an option. So prior to World War II, we lacked these ethical standards and these oversights, and we really kind of targeted vulnerable populations, such as prisoners. You guys all know what prisoners I'm referring to, especially in Nazi-occupied Germany or Nazi-occupied Europe. Orphans were often taken and studied, and the mentally ill. So researchers would prefer to use these vulnerable populations. And these subjects, they had no regard for their rights, and there was no regard for their well-being. And many people died because of this. This period was really just kind of marked by an absence of ethical standards and ethical guidelines. And many human beings were mistreated as research subjects. So it wasn't until after the war, after World War II, that any sort of significant ethical reforms really came to be. And one of those big ethical reforms that came about were the Nuremberg Code or the Nuremberg Trials. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So this was all prior to World War II. We were doing lots of horrible things to these very vulnerable populations that didn't have a voice of their own, and there was no protection. And then, of course, we get to the Nazis in World War II and Nazi-occupied Europe. And the more land that they expanded upon, the more subjects that they could bring into their research with no regard to their safety, well-being, or their health whatsoever. So these individuals, they conducted horrifying experiments. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how these experiments were done to basically give them a better footing in battle or in war. So here's some pictures here of some experiments that were conducted. So they did hyperthermia experiments. They conducted studies on twins, right? So they were really interested in any sort of genetic connections between two individuals that shared a womb. They did high altitude experiments and chemical and biological warfare experiments. So what were these hyperthermia experiments? Well, these prisoners were basically immersed in ice cold water, and they were just left outside in the freezing conditions. And basically the Nazis would study the effect of these extreme cold on the human body. So these researchers sought to determine how long it would take for a human being to die from hypothermia. And they essentially also wanted to test the differences with the methods of rewarming. So what would happen if we would rewarm a body quickly? What would happen if we rewarmed a body slowly? What would happen if we didn't rewarm the body whatsoever? They also conducted, like I said, some studies on twins. And these experiments would involve twins who were subjected to very painful procedures, such as surgeries without anesthesia. They were given injections of various chemical agents. They were given intentional infections, and they would basically look at the genetic differences or the similarities to how these bodies would respond to these agents that they were given to. This was kind of like the early research to gene manipulation or genomic research, and it started in Nazi Germany. Some other things they had done was high altitude experiments. So some of these prisoners were placed in very low pressure chambers just to kind of stimulate this high altitude conditions. And these experiments aimed to study what the effects of rapid decompression were on human beings, to basically increase safety standards for German pilots. And many of these poor human beings, they suffered severe injuries and died from these procedures. And then the chemical agents and the biological warfare experiments, you could just imagine how horrible those were. So some of the other things they did is they would do seawater tests where people would be forced only to drink seawater to see how long they would survive. They would probably doing those experiments for the German pilots as well, just in case a plane went down over water. They could see how long their pilots would survive that experience. They would deliberately poison human beings, and these people would go into organ failure and death. They would do sterilization. So just really horrible things they would do to these human beings. So these experiments that they had done on human beings, well, these were kind of characterized by extreme cruelty and a blatant disregard for human life, and all it really led to was suffering and the deaths of thousands of people. And many of the researchers there that were conducting this were doctors within the Nazi regime. So this really kind of highlighted this need for ethical standards in human research. And all of these atrocities would eventually contribute to the development of the Nuremberg Code in 1947. Okay, so now we're going to move on to some experiments that were happening on the other side of the pond, which is here in the United States during that same time. So apparently it wasn't just the Nazis who were up to no good. It was also Americans doing similar types of activities to, again, populations that were vulnerable. So let's move on to the Tuskegee studies. So the Tuskegee studies was a notorious study that was conducted in the United States. And it was done from 1933 to 1972. It basically involved 600 African American men from Tuskegee, Alabama. 399 of them had syphilis, and 201 did not have syphilis. So this study was aimed to observe what would happen with the natural progression of syphilis without providing any treatment whatsoever to the participants, right? This is horrific. And they were focusing on this untreated progression of this disease, specifically in African American men. So the participants, they were not informed of their diagnosis, and they were misled into believing that they were actually receiving free medical treatment for bad blood. So they were lied to from start to finish within these studies. And this is considered to be a profound violation of ethical principles in research. And this also was a direct highlighting of the systemic racism in medical research that was prominent during that time. So we weren't any better than the Nazis during this time, and it led to a significant loss of trust in the medical community, especially among the African Americans, and ultimately it contributed to the establishment of stricter ethical guidelines for research involving human subjects. So even though this was horrific, of course, it did have a silver lining, and I just wanted to show you some images of how the body was responding to syphilis and the sores that are presented by this condition. There are 4 stages of this disease, and it comes with these ulcers or these sores. So you can see the difference between early stages and more profound late stages on the bottom picture there. And if left untreated, this leads to severe brain, heart, neurological, and other organ failures. And this could also lead to paralysis and blindness and dementia, and in most cases, even death. So this was something that we were doing here in the States. And this study, like I had said, this Tuskegee syphilis study, also led to pretty significant changes in research and in research ethics, because this was exposing these human beings to these violations, and it was obviously a horrible form of systemic racism, and it occurred to so many men. So the public outcry during this time, following this study, in 1972, prompted this reevaluation for these ethical standards, especially in medical research. And in response to this, the U.S. government established something called the National Commission for Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. And this led to the development of something called the Belmont Report, which happened in 1979. So here in the United States, we got the Belmont Report, and then over in Europe, they got the Nuremberg Code. So on this next set of slides here, we're going to just look at these two right now because I'm not going to go into this Declaration of Helsinki, but we're going to look at what was going on in Europe in 1949, what was going on over here in 1979, and kind of talk about how these things led to what we're going to talk about on this next little lecture, which was conflicts of interest, having something called research misconduct, establishing something called informed consent, and being completely transparent about what is going to be done to you and how long it's going to be done to you. And then we led to the development of this institutional review board, which is a very stringent board that looks at everything that a researcher does. Here at UIC, with all the research we were doing with muscle biopsies, the IRB, they went over our research proposals with a very fine-tooth comb to make sure that we were not causing any sort of emotional, physiological, or physical damage with the biopsies we were doing on skeletal muscle. So whenever we submitted to do any type of research project, we knew it was going to be about 3 to 4 months before we could actually do anything because we knew the IRB was going to go through it with a fine tooth comb. And that's totally acceptable, and it's completely fine because at the end of the day, when we bring somebody in to do research and we want to get their tissue, ideally we want to make sure everyone goes home safe and everyone is satisfied and we don't cause any sort of damage in any capacity. So let's look at what this Nuremberg Code was. Essentially, this was established in 1947 after World War II, and it was the first initial step forward in setting ethical guidelines for conducting research. And it was created in response to those medical experiments that were conducted by the Nazi doctors during the Holocaust. And the code emphasized the necessity of voluntary consent from research participants. And again, what does this mean? Well, this means that they are fully informed about the study and they agree to participate without any sort of confusion or any sort of lies being told to them, much like we saw with the Tuskegee individuals. This code also mandates, let me just kind of move to the next slide here so we have this up and I can kind of... This code mandates that experiments should be aimed to benefit society, not just benefit military, but benefit society as whole, and really try to avoid any unnecessary suffering. And also that it be conducted by qualified professionals. So if we're talking about you as students, well, that's one of the reasons you have to take this course. You have to understand the injustices that were done in the past and make sure we don't do anything like that again, even if it is intentional or unintentional. We want to make sure that anyone that steps foot into our laboratories is completely informed and we are completely transparent about everything that is done. And if there are any risks associated with it, they have to know what those risks are so that they can opt out of the study if they decide that it's not for them. So this was incredibly important because it laid the foundation for modern research ethics. And even though it was happening in Europe, we didn't really get that message with in the United States, especially with the Tuskegee research. So this is really considered a cornerstone in ethical research practices worldwide. And this is kind of here you can see some of the major things that they wanted to accomplish with this. So again, voluntary consent, a subject's right to withdraw. And when we consent people in our laboratories, we have to tell them, you have the right to withdraw at any time without any questions being asked. That's very important. And you can see avoiding unnecessary suffering. Whatever we do, it's a beneficial result. So when we did muscle biopsies and we were doing it in type 2 diabetics, we wanted to see how exercise was changing either the proteome or the genome in the muscle. We would tell them that, we are looking to see how quickly skeletal muscle will respond to exercise in a diabetic condition, which might help in arresting and reversing the role of type 2 diabetes in metabolism. So we were doing it for the good of humanity to get this beneficial result. We want to make sure that we have we have a justified design. We should anticipate results that should be associated with conducting these experiments. Qualified personnel, that's why those of you that look to be a PhD, that's why this is not a 2-year process. It is 4-year, 6-year. In my case, it was a 9-year process. We have to make sure you are qualified. There are no fatal risks. So that's basically it. And then you can kind of look over this section right here because I've been kind of beating a dead horse. Okay. And if we move to the next one, which was the Belmont report, and as I said, the Belmont report was conducted here in the United States, and this was far later on. This was published and established for the first time in 1979, and it's a foundational document here that was outlining ethical principles and guidelines for conducting research in human beings in the United States. And it was developed specifically in response to the unethical studies that were being done here, such as the Tuskegee syphilis study. And this report just basically identifies 3 core principles. And I can move here and just kind of show you that. And then I promise you this will be the last slide for this short one. So these 3 core principles are basically demonstrating respect for the person, which involves recognizing the autonomy and the protection of the rights of the participants. The other core principle would be the benefit, which requires minimizing any sort of harm and maximizing benefits. And then justice, which ensures that we have fair distribution of burdens and benefits of research. What does that mean? That means that we avoid exploitation of any specific type of demographic. So this is what came of the Belmont report. And the combination of these 2 things, the Nuremberg, the Belmont, and even the Helsinki report that was also at the same time as the Nuremberg Code, this basically puts us at the doorstep of modern research and the ethics that we have designed and the responsibilities that we have designed over the course of the last 80 years to make sure that we are protecting participants, and we are giving them, again, what I'm going to move into very soon here. We are giving them the right to be informed, the right to remove themselves, the right to feel protected and have their personal information protected. And it has to be reviewed by the Institutional Review Board that makes sure that we are not doing any research misconduct and there are no conflicts of interest with our research. So I'm going to stop there because I gave you guys 2 videos over the weekend here, and I would like you to just kind of watch them and get caught up. And then I will give you part B to this very shortly, and I will see you guys soon. Take care.